Hello everyone, Mr. Phantom Knight here. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, I want to thank you for your continued support and for joining us on this journey into the unknown. Tonight's story comes from a subscriber named Laura, who shared a truly unsettling experience her family had during a nighttime road trip. It's a gripping account of eerie and inexplicable events that unfolded at a seemingly innocuous rest stop. So make sure you're comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Hi Mr. Phantom Knight, I'm Laura from Denver, Colorado, and I want to share an experience my family and I had during a road trip a few years ago. What was meant to be a fun and relaxing family getaway turned into a night of sheer terror that we'll never forget. Our journey began on a late summer evening as we set out on a cross-country road trip to visit my sister in North Carolina. We had planned the trip for months, mapping out the scenic routes and preparing for long hours on the road. My husband Steve was excited to show the kids the sights, and I was looking forward to some quality family time. Our children, Emily and Jack, were 9 and 6 at the time, full of energy and excitement for the adventure ahead. The first leg of our trip was uneventful. We drove through the flat plains of Kansas, the rolling hills of Missouri, and into the dense forests of Kentucky. The sun had set hours ago, and as we crossed into Tennessee, we decided to stop at a rest stop to stretch our legs, use the restroom, and grab some snacks. The rest stop was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, and it seemed almost deserted. The only illumination came from the dim streetlights that flickered sporadically, casting long shadows on the ground. As we pulled into the parking lot, I felt an inexplicable unease settle over me. The rest stop was eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. The building itself was old and worn, its windows darkened by years of grime and neglect. A small handwritten sign taped to the glass door read, "Open," though it looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. Steve parked the car, and we all got out to stretch our legs. Emily and Jack, ever the energetic children, immediately ran off to explore the area. I called after them, warning them not to wander too far, but my voice seemed to get lost in the thick, humid air. Steve and I decided to head inside to grab some refreshments while the kids played. The convenience store was small and cramped, with narrow aisles lined with dusty shelves. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast an unnatural glow on everything, making the colors seem off, almost washed out. As we walked in, a bell above the door jingled weakly, the sound echoing through the empty space. The air inside was stale, as if the place hadn't been properly ventilated in years. We walked up to the counter where an old man stood, his back turned to us as he fiddled with something beneath the counter. When he finally turned around, I was struck by how gaunt and tired he looked. His eyes were sunken and hollow, his skin pale and sallow. He greeted us with a slow nod, his voice raspy and weak. "Evening," he croaked, his gaze shifting between the two of us. "What can I do for you folks?" There was something unsettling about his demeanor, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Steve gave him a friendly smile and asked if he could point us to the nearest restroom. The old man hesitated for a moment before nodding and pointing down a narrow hallway to the left of the counter. "Down that way, last door on the right," he said. "But be careful, lights in there have been acting up." I thanked him and started to walk down the hallway, but the man's words lingered in my mind. There was something about the way he said it, almost as if he was warning me about something more than just faulty lights. The hallway was even darker than the main store, the flickering lights overhead casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and I could hear the faint dripping of water somewhere nearby. As I reached the restroom door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. A strange feeling washed over me, a sense of foreboding that made my heart race. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the irrational fear, and pushed the door open. The restroom was small and cramped, with cracked tiles lining the walls and a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The mirror above the sink was smeared with grime, and the air was thick with the smell of dampness and decay. I quickly did what I needed to do, eager to get out of the unsettling space. As I washed my hands, I couldn't help but glance up at the mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the reflection, a shadowy figure standing just behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, but the restroom was empty. I stood there frozen, my breath caught in my throat. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the dim light and my tired mind were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I hurried out of the restroom and back to the store, where Steve was waiting for me with a bag of snacks. He looked up as I approached, concern etched on his face. "You okay?" he asked, noticing the tension in my expression. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Let's just get out of here." We paid for our items and left the store, the old man watching us silently as we walked out. As we stepped outside, I noticed that Emily and Jack were no longer by the vending machines where I'd last seen them. Panic flared in my chest and I called out their names, my voice trembling with fear. For a moment there was no response and I felt my heart sink, but then I heard their voices, faint and distant, coming from behind the building. I rushed over, my heart pounding in my ears, and found them standing at the edge of the woods, staring up at something in the trees. "What are you doing out here?" I scolded, grabbing them by the arms and pulling them away from the woods. "You scared me half to death." "But Mom," Emily protested, her eyes wide with confusion. "We saw someone up there. They were waving at us." I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked up at the trees. There was nothing there, no one in sight. The branches swayed gently in the breeze, but the woods were silent and still. I glanced back at Steve, who was standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Let's go," he said quietly, his voice strained. "We've been here long enough." We hurried back to the car, the eerie silence pressing in around us. As we drove away from the rest stop, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The night was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The kids were unusually quiet, their earlier excitement replaced by a palpable unease. We drove for about an hour, the dark, winding road stretching out before us. The trees loomed on either side, their twisted branches forming a canopy overhead. The only light came from the headlights cutting through the darkness, casting long, distorted shadows on the road. Suddenly, the car began to sputter. The engine choked and stuttered before finally dying altogether. Steve cursed under his breath as he tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't budge. We were stranded, miles away from the nearest town, with no cell service and no way to contact anyone for help. As Steve got out to check under the hood, I stayed in the car with the kids, trying to keep them calm. But the tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel the fear creeping back in. The woods seemed to close in around us, the darkness pressing in on all sides. I watched as Steve worked on the engine, his movements tense and hurried. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, or someone, standing in the shadows at the edge of the woods. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my heart begin to race. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I squinted, I could see the outline of a person. Tall and thin, standing perfectly still in the darkness. I couldn't make out any details, but there was something unsettling about the way they stood, motionless and silent, watching us from the shadows. I called out to Steve, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, following my gaze, but by the time he turned around, the figure had vanished. "What is it?" he asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I thought I saw someone," I said, my voice trembling, "standing in the woods, watching us." Steve's expression darkened, and he quickly turned back to the engine, his movements more frantic now. I could tell he was just as unnerved as I was, though he was trying to hide it for the kids' sake. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the car grew unbearable. The woods around us were eerily silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, nothing but an oppressive, suffocating stillness. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on us, and I knew we needed to get out of there as soon as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Steve managed to get the engine started. The car roared to life, and we all breathed a sigh of relief. But as we pulled back onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something or someone was following us. The drive was tense and silent. The kids had fallen asleep in the back seat, but Steve and I were on edge, our eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. The darkness outside seemed to close in around us, the trees looming closer and closer with each passing mile. Just when we thought we were finally safe, the car began to act up again. The engine sputtered and choked, the headlights flickering in and out. Steve gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as he tried to keep the car moving. Come on," he muttered under his breath, his voice laced with desperation. But then, just as we rounded a bend in the road, the car suddenly veered to the left, swerving off the road and into the trees. Steve tried to regain control, but it was too late. The car skidded off the pavement and into the woods, crashing into a tree with a sickening crunch. The impact was jarring, and for a moment, everything was a blur. The kid screamed, and I felt the wind knocked out of me as the seatbelt dug into my chest. The car had come to a stop, but we were now stranded in the middle of the woods, miles from the nearest town. Steve quickly checked on the kids to make sure they were okay, and then he turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice low and urgent. Now. I didn't need to be told twice. We quickly gathered our things and got out of the car, the oppressive darkness of the woods closing in around us. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and smoke, and I could hear the faint crackling of the engine as it began to cool. But as we started to walk back toward the road, I heard something, a faint rustling in the trees, followed by the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and strained to listen. There it was again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I grabbed Steve's arm, my fingers digging into his skin. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. Steve nodded, his eyes wide with terror. The footsteps were getting closer now, the sound growing louder with each passing second. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. We started to walk faster, our footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the woods. But the footsteps behind us only quickened, matching our pace, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. "Run," Steve said suddenly, his voice tight with fear. "Run." We broke into a sprint, our feet pounding against the ground as we raced through the trees. The footsteps behind us grew louder, faster, closer, and I could feel the weight of someone, bearing down on us. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The trees blurred past me, the darkness closing in on all sides, and I could hear Emily and Jack crying out in fear as they tried to keep up. We burst out of the woods and onto the road, the cold asphalt beneath our feet a stark contrast to the soft, damp earth of the forest. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were right behind us, relentless, and I knew we had to keep running. We ran for what felt like miles, the darkness pressing in around us, the footsteps never far behind. My legs burned with exhaustion, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop, not when we were so close to safety. Finally, just when I thought I couldn't run any farther, we saw the lights of a small town in the distance. The relief was overwhelming, and I felt a surge of hope as we sprinted toward the lights, the footsteps behind us finally fading away. We stumbled into the town, gasping for breath, our clothes torn and dirty, our bodies bruised and battered. The townspeople stared at us in shock, their faces etched with concern, and we were quickly surrounded by a crowd of curious onlookers. But all I could think about was how close we had come to whatever had been following us. The terror of that night was still fresh in my mind, and I knew that we had narrowly escaped something far more sinister than we could ever have imagined. We were taken to a small motel in town, where we spent the night trying to recover from our ordeal. The police were called, and they searched the woods where our car had crashed, but they found nothing, no footprints, no signs of anyone else in the area. We left the next morning, shaken but grateful to be alive. The rest of our trip was somber and subdued, the excitement of our journey overshadowed by the terror we had experienced. We never spoke about it again, not even to each other. It was as if we all silently agreed that some things were better left forgotten. But I'll never forget that night. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of being hunted by something we couldn't see or understand. And I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps, relentless and unyielding, chasing us through the darkness. To this day, I still avoid driving through that part of the country at night. The memory of what happened is too vivid, too real. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there in the woods that night is still waiting, still watching, still looking for its next victim. Thank you for taking the time to read my story, Your Name. I hope it serves as a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary places can hide the most extraordinary and terrifying secrets. Thanks for listening, Laura. Thank you for joining me in exploring Laura's unsettling experience at the rest stop. It's a chilling reminder that even the most ordinary places can harbor the most extraordinary and eerie events. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more spine-tingling tales, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Your support is what keeps us going and brings more stories like this to light. Stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the road less traveled hides the most unsettling secrets. Until next time, keep your headlights on and your mind open. Thanks for watching. Mr. Phantom Night.